Somewhere in the four Gospels, spread across roughly 3 years, Jesus performs more than 36 miracles. A wedding runs out of wine. A storm goes quiet in the middle of a sentence. A man born blind sees color for the first time in his life. A man 4 days dead walks out of a tomb, still wrapped in burial cloths. On the surface, these look like a scattered highlight reel. Dramatic moments the gospel writers picked out because they were memorable. That's how most people read them. One miracle here, another miracle there. No particular order, no particular logic. Just proof that Jesus was powerful. A greatest hits list, essentially, assembled after the fact. But arrange all of them. Every miracle, in the actual order they happened, not the order the four different writers happened to mention them. And something else appears. Something none of the four writers ever spell out directly in so many words, but something they clearly expected a careful, patient reader to notice on their own. The miracles don't stay in one lane. They climb. The first one is quiet. Water becomes wine at a small-town wedding, and almost no one at the party even realizes what happened. The last ones are not quiet at all. By the end, Jesus is commanding a man dead 4 days to come back to life, in front of a crowd, on purpose, as a public statement no one in that town would ever be able to unsee. That's not a coincidence of storytelling. That's a structure. Between those 2 points, the miracles move through categories most people never stop to separate out from one another. Healing a single body, casting out a spirit, calming a literal storm, feeding thousands of people from almost nothing, giving sight to a man who never had it to begin with, and finally, reversing death itself, first once, quietly, on someone else, and then, unmistakably, on himself. Each category is bigger, harder, and more public than the one before it. And each one. This is the part that's easy to miss if you've only ever read these stories one at a time. Answers a specific piece of what went wrong at the very beginning of the Bible, back in Genesis chapter 3, when sickness, scarcity, spiritual conflict, and death first entered the human story. So here's the real question this video is going to walk through, slowly, in order. If you lined up every miracle Jesus performed, all 37 of them, roughly, and matched them against everything that broke in Genesis 3, would it line up cleanly? Would there be a piece missing? Or does Jesus, across 3 years of ministry, methodically undo every single category of brokenness the human story has ever known, in an order that gets harder to explain away the further you follow it? Stay with this one all the way through. By the end, the order itself becomes the argument. To see the pattern, you have to start with a small, almost boring fact. The Gospels were not written as one continuous biography. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John each recorded events they considered important, sometimes in the order they happened, sometimes grouped by theme instead. That's why, if you only ever read one gospel at a time, the miracles can feel scattered, a healing here, a nature miracle there, no obvious thread connecting them. But when scholars line up all 4 accounts side by side and reconstruct the actual chronological order, using details like which Passover Jesus was near, which towns he'd already visited, and how the events reference each other, a timeline emerges. And once you can see the whole timeline at once, instead of one gospel at a time, the miracles stop looking random. Here's the piece that makes this timeline worth studying closely, Genesis chapter 3. That's where everything breaks. A man and a woman disobey a single instruction, and 4 specific fractures enter the human story in that one chapter, in a specific order that's worth naming carefully. The ground is cursed, scarcity, thorns, hard labor, just to produce enough food to live. The relationship between people and God is broken. Shame, hiding, a closeness that used to be natural now requiring distance. The serpent, a stand-in for spiritual opposition that will run through the rest of the Bible, is placed in permanent, ongoing conflict with humanity. And death enters, for the first time, as a real and certain future for every person who will ever live, where before it simply wasn't part of the picture at all. Sickness, scarcity, spiritual bondage, death, for categories of brokenness, all traced back to one chapter near the start of the Bible. Now hold that list in your mind, because it's the map. Every miracle Jesus performs over the next 3 years falls into one of those 4 categories, and the order in which he performs them isn't neutral. It escalates. It starts small. At a wedding in the village of Cana, the wine runs out. A minor social embarrassment, not a life or death emergency. Jesus turns water into wine. John, writing about it later, calls it the first of his signs, deliberately choosing a word that means more than just a magic trick. A sign points beyond itself. And what this first sign points to is simple. The man doing this has authority over matter itself, over creation at its most basic level, before he's healed a single sick person or cast out a single demon. From there, the miracles begin working through individual human bodies. A Roman officer's servant is healed from a distance, with nothing but a word, showing that Jesus' authority doesn't require his physical presence, only his intention. Peter's mother-in-law, sick with a fever, is healed with a touch. A man with leprosy, a disease that made him unclean and untouchable under Jewish law, is healed, and Jesus touches him to do it, willingly taking on the very uncleanness the law was designed to keep at a distance. Then something shifts. A paralyzed man is lowered through a roof by 4 friends who couldn't get through the crowd any other way. Jesus looks at him and says something unexpected, not "be healed," but "your sins are forgiven." Only afterward does he heal the man's legs, and he says so directly, "I heal your body so you'll know I have the authority to forgive what's actually broken in you." That's the hinge point. Because up to now, every miracle has addressed something visible, sickness, disease, a body that doesn't work. But this one names the deeper fracture from Genesis 3 directly, the separation between a person and God. Healing the legs was almost the demonstration. Forgiving the sin was the actual miracle. Not long after, in a synagogue, Jesus heals a man with a withered hand. On the Sabbath, the day of rest when Jewish law forbade this kind of work. The religious leaders watching are furious, not because the man wasn't genuinely healed, but because Jesus keeps claiming an authority over the law itself, not just over sickness. It's a small miracle in physical terms, one hand, but a large one in terms of what it's claiming. This isn't only about fixing bodies. It's about who gets to decide what healing is allowed and when. And then, quietly, something happens that almost gets lost among the bigger miracles still to come. In a town called Nain, Jesus meets a funeral procession on the road, a widow burying her only son. He hasn't been asked to do anything. No one requests a miracle. Jesus simply looks at the grieving mother, tells her not to cry, touches the coffin, and speaks directly to the dead. "Young man, I say to you, get up." And the young man sits up and starts talking. Hold on to that moment, because it matters later. This is the first time in the order that Jesus reverses death itself, and notice how small and private it is. One family, no audience gathered for the purpose, no advance warning, just compassion for a grieving mother on the side of a road. It won't stay this quiet. But for now, it's the first crack in the fourth and final fracture from Genesis 3, and it happens almost in passing. From there, the miracles keep climbing outward, from individual bodies, into the spiritual realm, and then into nature itself, at a scale no single healing has reached yet. And that's exactly where the story is headed next. Before we get to the part where the pattern really opens up, where Jesus stops healing one person at a time and starts commanding entire storms and feeding entire crowds, it's worth pausing for 1 second. If this is the first time you're watching one of these videos, this channel walks through scripture like this regularly. Not just retelling the stories you already know, but slowing down long enough to notice what's actually being said between the lines, in the order it was actually said. If that's useful to you, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. And there's a comment section below if you want to point out a detail in this timeline worth going deeper on. Okay, back to the timeline. Because up to this point, every miracle has stayed relatively small in scale. One person, one town, one moment, mostly witnessed by whoever happened to be standing nearby. That's about to change completely. The next stretch of Jesus' ministry is where the miracles stop being personal and start being public, where entire crowds watch, where nature itself starts obeying him the same way a sick body did, and where the geography widens from a handful of towns in Galilee to regions Jesus' own people didn't consider part of their story at all. This is where the escalation really becomes impossible to ignore. The next category is spiritual opposition, the second fracture from Genesis 3, where the serpent is set against humanity. Early in his ministry, in a synagogue in Capernaum, a man with what the text calls an unclean spirit cries out, recognizing Jesus before anyone else in the room does. Jesus commands the spirit to leave, and it obeys instantly, publicly, in the middle of a worship service. Later, in a region called Gerasa, he encounters a man possessed by so many spirits that they identify themselves as legion, a Roman military term for thousands of soldiers. One man, previously so violent he lived among tombs, is healed completely, in front of witnesses from an entire region. Notice the jump from one quiet spirit in one synagogue, in front of a small congregation who'd known Jesus for maybe a few weeks, to a legion, an entire army's worth of spiritual opposition, in a region outside Jewish territory entirely, dismissed with a sentence, in front of witnesses who had no prior context for who Jesus even was. Same category of miracle, vastly larger scale, vastly less friendly ground to perform it on. Then nature enters the picture directly. Jesus and his disciples are in a boat when a sudden storm nearly sinks them. The disciples, several of them experienced fishermen, are terrified. Jesus is asleep. When they wake him, he doesn't pray for calm. He speaks directly to the wind and the waves, the way you'd speak to a person. Peace. Be still. And the storm obeys immediately. That single moment answers the third fracture from Genesis 3, the cursed, chaotic ground, the world no longer fully cooperating with humanity the way it was designed to. Jesus doesn't ask nature to calm down. He commands it, the same way he commanded the unclean spirit, the same way he commanded the water to become wine. From there, the miracles scale up again, not in category, but in size. A crowd of thousands follows Jesus into a remote area with no food source nearby. A boy offers 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Jesus takes that small amount, gives thanks, and it multiplies in his hands until over 5,000 people are fed, with baskets of food left over. This reverses the second fracture from Genesis 3, the cursed ground, the scarcity, The sweat of your brow struggled just to eat. Not for one person, but for an entire crowd, from almost nothing. That same night, walking across the surface of a lake toward his disciples' boat, Jesus does something even the storm-calming miracle didn't fully show. He doesn't just command nature. He simply isn't bound by its normal rules at all. Water that should sink a person holds his weight instead. Not long after, Jesus travels into Gentile territory, outside Israel entirely, where a woman from the region of Tyre and Sidon begs him to free her daughter from a tormenting spirit. She isn't Jewish, isn't part of the covenant people the miracles have focused on so far, and Jesus initially tests her persistence before granting the request. It happens again at a distance, with a word, the same way the centurion's servant was healed earlier. The point sharpens here. Whatever this authority is, it was never going to stay confined to one nation. Around the same time, a deaf man who also struggles to speak clearly is brought to Jesus in the Decapolis, another largely non-Jewish region. Jesus touches his ears, touches his tongue, and the man hears and speaks normally, a single sense restored, almost gently, compared to what's coming. Soon after, the feeding miracle happens again, a second time, in a different region, for a different crowd of 4,000 people, from 7 loaves and a few small fish. Some readers skim past this one, assuming it's just a repeat of the first feeding. It isn't filler. It's the same reversal of scarcity, repeated deliberately in Gentile territory this time, making the same point the Syrophoenician woman's healing already made. This provision was never meant for one group of people only. Near a village called Bethsaida, a blind man is brought to Jesus, and this healing happens in 2 stages. First, blurred shapes. I see people, but they look like trees walking. And then, after Jesus touches his eyes a second time, full clarity. It's the only miracle in the entire Gospels that unfolds gradually instead of instantly, and it functions almost like a hinge. Sight, restored in stages, foreshadowing a far more radical sight miracle just ahead, where there will be no stage 1 to build on at all. Around this same period, a boy brought to the disciples for healing. A boy who convulses and has been thrown into fire and water by the spirit tormenting him. Can't be helped by the disciples at all, even though they'd successfully cast out spirits before. Jesus heals him after coming down from what's often called the Transfiguration, a moment where his appearance briefly changes and he's seen talking with Moses and Elijah. The disciples' failure here matters as much as the healing itself. It shows this authority isn't a technique that can be borrowed or repeated by formula. It travels with Jesus specifically. By this point in the timeline, every category from Genesis 3 has been touched at least once: sickness, spiritual opposition, the natural world, scarcity, and each time, at a larger, more public, and more geographically widespread scale than the miracle before it. There are still 2 categories left. One of them is easy to overlook. The other is the one everything has been building toward. The next miracle in the order is easy to file under another healing. It isn't. In Jerusalem, Jesus encounters a man who has been blind from birth. Not someone who lost his sight and might get it back, but someone whose eyes have never once worked, not for a single day of his life. Jesus makes mud from dirt and his own saliva, places it on the man's eyes, and tells him to go wash it off in a nearby pool. The man does, and for the first time since the day he was born, he sees. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it's a different kind of miracle than everything before it. Healing a sick body restores something that used to work. Casting out a spirit removes something that shouldn't be there. Calming a storm redirects something that already exists. Even the two-stage healing at Bethsaida was still restoring sight that had existed once and gone dark, but giving sight to eyes that have never functioned. Not once, ever, not for a single day of this man's life, isn't restoration. It's origination. It's closer to the very first chapter of Genesis, where God speaks and light exists where there was none before, than to anything Jesus has done so far in this timeline. That's the fifth fracture, the one it's easy to miss if you're only tracking sickness, scarcity, spiritual bondage, and chaos. The world as originally designed, working exactly as intended, the way it was before anything broke at all. And Jesus doesn't just fix something damaged. He creates, fully formed, a function that was never there to begin with. Around this same stretch of the timeline, two smaller miracles quietly reinforce the same idea from a different angle. A woman who has been bent over, unable to stand fully upright, for 18 years is healed on the Sabbath, and Jesus describes her condition as being bound by Satan, tying her physical affliction directly back to that second fracture, spiritual opposition, even though no exorcism is described. And 10 men with leprosy are cleansed at once on the road to Jerusalem. Only one of them, a Samaritan, an outsider even to the outsiders, turns back to say thank you. 10 healed. One who noticed what had actually happened to him. It's a small, easy-to-skip detail that says something uncomfortable. Proximity to a miracle and recognizing a miracle are not automatically the same thing. One category remains, the one every single miracle before it has quietly been pointing toward. In a village called Bethany, a man named Lazarus, a close friend of Jesus, becomes sick and dies. By the time Jesus arrives, Lazarus has been in the tomb 4 days. In that culture, 4 days mattered specifically. It was long enough that no one could claim he'd merely fainted, or that his spirit was somehow lingering nearby, as some believed happened for up to 3 days after death. 4 days meant genuinely, unmistakably, decomposing dead. Jesus doesn't rush to explain any of this. He stands outside the tomb, and he weeps, grief that's real, not performed, even though he already knows exactly what he's about to do. And then he does something no miracle before this one has done. He calls out, in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And Lazarus does, still wrapped in the burial cloths, needing help even to walk. Genuinely, publicly, undeniably alive again. Remember the widow's son back in Nain, quiet, private, unrequested, a single family on the side of a road. This is the same category of miracle, reversing death, but everything about it is scaled up. It's requested. It's delayed on purpose, specifically so the body would be undeniably decomposing by the time Jesus arrives. It happens near Jerusalem, close to the religious establishment that's already watching Jesus closely, and it happens in front of enough witnesses that word of it reaches the authorities within days. Where the first resurrection in this order was a quiet compassion, this one is a public, deliberate, unmistakable claim. Every fracture from Genesis 3 has now been addressed, in an order that climbs steadily upward in scale and difficulty. Sickness in a single body, then spiritual opposition, then the natural world, then scarcity across an entire crowd, then a sense untouched since birth, and now, finally, death itself, reversed, on purpose, in public, for days in. But here's the piece that reframes everything that came before it. Lazarus's resurrection wasn't the final miracle. It was the second to last one, because a short time later, Jesus himself is arrested, killed, and buried, and 3 days after that, the tomb is empty, and he is alive again in a way that isn't temporary. Lazarus eventually died a second time, years later, the way every person eventually does. Jesus did not. That's the peace the whole order has been building toward from the very beginning. The wedding at Cana, the calm storm, the 5,000 fed, the man born blind, the widow's son at Nain, Lazarus walking out of his tomb. Every one of those miracles was a smaller scale preview of the one Jesus was ultimately going to perform on himself. And this is the one none of the eyewitnesses could stage manage, explain away, or quietly walk back later, because too many of them were willing to die insisting they'd seen it with their own eyes. If he could reverse decay in a friend's body after 4 days, the resurrection asks you to consider what it means that he then did the same thing to his own, permanently, this time with no third occurrence needed. The pattern isn't just a clever way to organize 30-some events. It's an argument, built in escalating order, that nothing broken in Genesis 3, not sickness, not scarcity, not spiritual bondage, not chaos, not even death, sits outside what Jesus has authority over. So if you go back through the order, water into wine, a healed servant, a forgiven paralytic, a widow's son quietly returned to her, a legion of spirits silenced, a storm stilled, thousands fed twice over on 2 different continents of people, a blind man's sight restored in stages, and then created outright, a friend 4 days dead standing up in front of witnesses. It stops looking like a random highlight reel. It starts looking like a map, moving in one deliberate direction, toward one final point that everything else was quietly rehearsing. Every category of brokenness introduced in Genesis 3 gets addressed, in order, at increasing scale and increasing publicity, until the very last miracle isn't performed on someone else at all. It's performed on Jesus himself, and it's the one none of the others could have been a genuine preview of unless it was actually true. Whatever category you place your own life into right now, sickness, scarcity, something spiritual you can't quite name, or grief over something that feels permanent, the pattern suggests it's not new territory. It's already been walked through, in order, on purpose, and reversed. That's the pattern hidden in plain sight across 4 Gospels and 3 years of ministry. Not hidden because it was meant to stay secret, but hidden because most people read these stories one at a time, instead of all at once, in order. If this kind of close reading is something you want more of, subscribe. There's a lot more in these books that most people skim right past. And if you want to go deeper into any single one of these 37 moments, let me know in the comments which one you'd want unpacked next. Thanks for watching.